This is a lecture on the article Abortion and the Sexual Agenda by Sydney Callahan. This is a picture of her with her husband Daniel Callahan. They are long-standing specialists in the field of bioethics. And what's interesting about these two is that they worked on abortion as a philosophical question early on in their careers, and actually came to different conclusions, where Daniel had more of a pro-choice position, whereas Sydney went in a pro-life direction. And what's also interesting about her position is that she's giving an argument that might seem to be somewhat unique, in the sense that she is arguing for a pro-life feminist position. It's often assumed that feminism requires a pro-choice, pro-abortion position, but she actually argues that abortion and a society that's permissive toward abortion actually works against feminist goals. So she says that feminism, whether pro-choice or pro-life, has certain goals like social equality, sexual fulfillment, personal development, and reproductive freedom. She thinks that these are common goals between pro-life and pro-choice feminists. And what she's arguing is that actually a pro-life position serves those goals, or helps to pursue those goals even better than a pro-choice, pro-abortion position. And so what she is arguing for is a more encompassing, inclusive ideal of justice. And so all feminists are seeking a kind of justice for women, but she is arguing that the pro-life position serves that better, to protect the powerless and dependent against unjust uses of power. So she talks about this on page 168. She says, just as women or blacks were considered too different, too underdeveloped, too biological to have souls or to possess legal rights, so the fetus is now seen as merely biological life, subsidiary to a person. Okay, so subordinate, not at the level of full personhood. A woman was once viewed as incorporated into the one flesh of her husband's person. She too was a form of bodily property. In all patriarchal, unjust systems, lesser orders of human life are granted rights only when wanted, chosen, or invested with value by the powerful. So this is a basic condition of injustice that she says is enacted against the unborn, and she's arguing that just as justice was expanded to include women and racial minorities, so the same should be true for unborn child. She says, fortunately, in the course of civilization, there's been a gradual realization that justice demands the powerless and dependent be protected against the uses of power wielded unilaterally. So to protect the powerless and dependent. So she thinks that justice requires this consideration be given to the unborn. And so this requires a more thoughtful understanding of what pregnancy is than a lot of the pro-choice philosophical arguments suggest. So she does say on 168 that the moral right to control one's own body does apply to cases of organ transplants, mastectomies, contraception, and sterilization. But it's not a conceptualization adequate for abortion. So in other words, the framework, the language of controlling one's own body makes sense in those sort of cases, like organ transplants, for instance. But that kind of conceptuality can't adequately account for the reality of pregnancy and abortion, what they are. So she says a few lines down on 168 that strained philosophical analogies fail to apply. Having a baby is not like rescuing a drowning person, being hooked up to a famous violinist's artificial life support system, donating organs for transplant, or anything else. And so you can see a reference to Thompson there. He's saying the analogies are strained. They don't really accurately reflect what's going on in pregnancy. And so this is why she also argues on page 172 against analogies or arguments that pit women against their own offspring. She says it's morally offensive and psychologically and politically destructive. So if we compare, say, a woman being pregnant to a person being hooked up to this violinist and forced to preserve their life, that really distorts the nature of what pregnancy is. Callahan also objects to what she thinks is a false view of autonomy, and one that emphasizes individual autonomy and active choice distorts our conception of what the moral life is. So the top of 171, she says, willing, planning, choosing one's moral commitments through the contracting of one's individual resources becomes the premier model of moral responsibility. So you can think of Thompson's argument. And Callahan's arguing that's not really, that's one part of the moral life, but that doesn't give the full scope of what the moral life involves. So she says, continuing on 171, morality also consists of the good and worthy acceptance of the unexpected events that life presents. Responsiveness and responsibility to things unchosen are also instances of the highest human moral capacity. Morality is not confined to contracted agreements of isolated individuals. Yes, one is obligated by explicit contracts freely initiated, but human beings are also obligated by implicit compacts and involuntary relationships in which persons simply find themselves. To be embedded in a family, a neighborhood, a social system brings moral obligations which were never entered into with informed consent. Okay? So there's no way just to extricate or remove yourself from the web or the network of relationships that all of us are entangled in. Just to be born already involves you in human communities that bring with them unchosen responsibilities. So parent-child relationships, she says, are one instance of implicit moral obligations arising by virtue of our being part of the interdependent human community. And so she thinks that pro-choice feminist ideology that emphasizes individual autonomy and control is distorting this fundamental basis of what moral life is like. And that's why she puts it on page 173. We start to see a conception of the child as a sort of investment, and the child is even private property. This is a project that I am undertaking rather than an independent life dependent upon me. This is sort of my choice and my project. She also argues that there are rival sexual ideals at work in the 20th and now the 21st century. A male-oriented model and a female-oriented model that goes back to the 19th century. So she sees the way that these have developed through particular cultural contexts, and she argues that, this is on 176, that a more male-oriented model of erotic or amative sexuality endorses sexual permissiveness without long-term commitment or reproductive focus. Erotic sexuality emphasizes pleasure, play, passion, individual self-expression, and romantic games of courtship and conquest. It's assumed that a variety of partners and sexual experiences are necessary to stimulate romantic passion. And this erotic model of the sexual life has often worked satisfactorily for men, both heterosexual and gay, and for certain cultural elites. But she argues that it's often most harmful to the most vulnerable members of society, women and children, and those who don't have the same sort of social power or money to clear up mistakes that they make. Okay, so the people who are the most vulnerable, who have the least money and power, have the smallest margin of error, are the least able to escape from unintended consequences of their mistakes. She also argues that this kind of model seems to work well for women when they're young, physically attractive, and economically powerful, and they're able to achieve enough success in their career to sacrifice family life. But she also points out how that leaves women increasingly vulnerable when they don't have that level of social capital, of youth and beauty, economic power. Instead, she argues that it would be better to recover an ideal of sexuality that developed, especially in the 19th century. That's interesting. I don't know why she focuses on the 19th century in particular. I think part of it is because she's looking back to the early days of the women's movement in that period, where there was a different conception of sexuality for women and the sexual life that wasn't just an imitation of this male model that she's describing, something like you see in Cosmopolitan magazine, right? This assumption that part of a fulfilled life is having this active and varied sexual life. So she says, since in Western culture, since the 19th century at least, most women have espoused a version of sexual functioning in which sex acts are embedded within deep emotional bonds and secure long-term commitments. Many of the most influential women in the 19th century women's movement reached and lived this sexual ethic, often by the side of exemplary feminist men. While the ideal has never been universally obtained, a culturally dominant demand for monogamy, self-control, and emotionally bonded and committed sex works well for women in every stage of their sexual life cycles. And so she goes on to talk about how this is good for young women because it protects from rape and seduction, adult women who receive support from men in child rearing, and older women who are protected from abandonment as their biological attractions wane. Now, some might point out that this was also a period of double standards, where men were allowed to cavort around freely and pursue women on the side, and women were not. But she points out that this was not countenanced in the older ideal. That was not, seen as acceptable. It was looked down upon and not accepted. And she says, actually, there is an ironic sort of double standard in the modern feminist ideal, where work and career are seen as a place for self-control. Women are urged, this is on page 176, women are urged to grow up, to display mature self-discipline and self-control. They're told to persevere in long-term commitments, to cope with unexpected obstacles by learning to tough out the inevitable sufferings and setbacks entailed in life and work. But, she says, this mature ethic of commitment and self-discipline is discounted in the domain of sexuality. There's been real success, women advancing in work and career and education, but when that's not applied in the realm of sexuality, it actually makes them more vulnerable, easier to exploit. So what she argues then is that for women to get what they need in order to combine childbearing, education, and careers, society has to recognize that female bodies come with wombs. They're not just a different form of men. Female bodies are unique, and women and their reproductive power and the children women have must be supported in new ways. Another and different round of feminist consciousness raising is needed, in which all of women's potential is accorded respect. This time, instead of humbly buying entree by conforming to male lifestyles, women will demand that society accommodate to them. So I look forward to seeing what you think of this whole article. I'm just highlighting a few of the key points, but it's quite a different perspective from what we see in Thompson and from what we probably hear most of the time in the debates. So I look forward to hearing what you think about the article as a whole and how this compares with Thompson's arguments in her defense of abortion. So I will see you in class.